The ancient Egyptians gave us many wonders: the pyramids, papyrus, toothpaste, and one of the oldest board games known to history, Senet. This time on the gaming bench. Senet is a two-player race game. To play, you need a Senet board comprised of 30 squares and 3 horizontal rows of 10 squares each, which, by the way, is why it's also called the game of 30 squares. Each player gets 5 to 7 pieces each. The number of pieces doesn't change gameplay. And instead of dice, it's traditional to use casting sticks or knuckle bones. I made this set. If you want to see how you can make your own Senet game board, there's a link in the description of my build video. There's also a link to a PDF download for a free game board. You can use just about anything for playing pieces, and popsicle sticks make cheap and easy to build casting sticks. When we talk about the rules of Senet, it's important to know that we're just making stuff up. There are no written accounts of the rules that have been discovered, so historians have used tomb paintings, illustrations, hints in written text, and conjecture to reconstruct a rule set. And as Senet was popular for a period of more than 3,000 years, it's certain that the rules changed and evolved over that time. So even if we knew the original rules, they may have been radically different a couple centuries later. I'm using the rule set developed by Professor Timothy Kendall, which has become the default rules for modern Senet players. The Kendall rules have you place all the pieces on the board to start, alternating between players in the first row. You cast your sticks to determine movement. These casting sticks are black on one side and light on the other. Movement is equal to the number of light sides showing. In this throw, for example, it would be a 3. If all 4 black sides are facing up, the move is a 5. Casts of 1, 4, and 5 give you an immediate extra turn. These extra turns stack, so if you throw a 1, you get an extra turn. If your next throw is a 4, you get an additional extra turn, and so on. Throw your sticks to see who goes first. Highest cast takes it. The player takes the right-handmost piece. Only one piece can occupy any space at a time, but you can jump over other pieces, either your opponent's or your own. You follow a backwards S path around the board. When you land on an opponent's piece, that piece is swapped to the space where you started your turn. If 2 of your pieces are side by side, they protect each other and they cannot be swapped, but your opponent can still jump over them. If 3 or more of your pieces are lined up, they form a blockade, and your opponent can neither swap them nor move past them. You can jump over your own blockades with a high enough throw. Note that pairs and blockades must be in straight lines. They don't bend around corners. You must move if there is a legal move available to you. If not, you lose your turn. When leaving the board, you must do so on an exact number. There are a number of special squares on the board. Square number 15 with the Ankh symbol is called the House of Life or the House of Rejuvenation. This is a safe square and you cannot be swapped while you're on it. You also get an immediate extra turn when you land there. Square 26 is the House of Beauty or the House of Joy. All pieces must stop on the square when they reach it, even if the throw would have taken them past it. These symbols on the House of Joy are called Nefer and represent perfect, good, or beautiful. While the symbol looks to me like a hanging spoon or maybe a lute, it's meant to represent a heart and trachea. Yeah, kind of gross. Square number 27 is the House of Water or the Waters of Chaos. This is a trap. Any piece landing on this square immediately moves back to the House of Rejuvenation. If there's already a piece there, then you move back to the next closest open space. Square number 28 is the House of 3 Truths. Your piece must stay on this square until you throw a 3 exactly to bar off. Square number 29 is the House of Re Atum. You must also stay on this space until you throw a 2 exactly. Now there are many rule variations, as you might expect with a 3,000-year-old game. Here are a couple of my favorites. Some versions of the rules indicate that you must move all of your pieces off of the first row before you can begin barring off any other pieces. One variation I really like is that if you don't have a legal move forward, you must instead move a piece backwards by the number thrown. Instead of swapping spaces with a piece when you land on it, some rules have you move the piece 1 space backwards. If that space is occupied, it goes back another and another until it lands on an open space. Senet can result in lots of extra turns. Some rules have you take the extra turn immediately, while others have you toss all the extra turns at once, pool the results, then move your pieces. And that's the rules. It's not unlike the modern game of Sorry, which itself is based on an ancient game. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that for the ancient Egyptians, it was literally a game of life and death. On November 6, 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter sent a telegram to his patron, George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. It read, "At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations. H. Carter." Carter had just discovered the tomb of King Tutankhamun, one of the most significant and magnificent finds in the field of archaeology. Among the treasures found in this largely undisturbed tomb were 4 complete sets of the ancient Egyptian game of Senet. Senet is often called the world's oldest board game, but this is nonsense, not only because we have extant versions of an even older game, Mehen, but also because it's likely that the true oldest games were simple games where the board was drawn into the dirt and played with shells or seeds or whatever else was on hand. These sorts of games leave no mark on the historical record, so we'll never know how they were played. But back to Senet. In addition to the sets found in King Tut's tomb, scores of other partial or complete Senet sets have been discovered almost exclusively in Egypt. The earliest examples we know of are fragments of boards that might be Senet found in burial sites dating back to 3100 BCE, nearly 2 centuries before the boy king was born. To give that context, this was the beginning of the Bronze Age when the earliest writing systems were just being developed. This means that it's possible that Senet predates written language. The first unequivocal example of Senet is found in the tomb of Hesi-Ra, circa 2613 BCE. His tomb didn't include an actual Senet set, but the game was depicted in a painting on the tomb wall. It would seem that Hesi was a gamer, because in addition to Senet, paintings also depicted other popular board games from the time. From roughly the same time period, we see a fantastic relief carving in the tomb of Hekiankh in Upper Egypt. It depicts 2 men sitting at a Senet board exchanging words while they play. The first says, "Your piece has alighted. Be happy, my heart, for I shall cause you to see it taken away." And the second man replies, "You speak as one weak of tongue, for passing is mine." Ancient trash talk. I guess some things never change. Now, Senet is all about passing. In fact, the full name of the game is Senet Net Nab, which translates to the game of passing through. As explained in the rules section, you often pass over your opponent as you both move towards the end of the board. But, as we'll see, passing would come to mean something much more significant. The earliest versions of Senet have the same 3 rows of 10 spaces, but are generally simple with little to no decoration. The starting position of Senet shifts from the upper left to the lower right at some point in the Middle Kingdom period. Eventually, it returns to the original orientation. But something much more important started to change during this period. The game is incredibly popular, being played by people of all social statuses. There are many examples of simple wooden boards, as well as boards scratched into stone, presumably for impromptu play. In this period, we also see boards built into clever boxes that hold all the playing pieces, and Senet sets of high officials and pharaohs are constructed of precious materials and highly decorated. But then, Senet begins to take on a religious significance. It starts to show up in ancient texts, notably the Book of the Dead. By at least the New Kingdom period, about 1550 to 1077 BCE, the Senet board illustrates the concept of the Ba, roughly the ancient Egyptian concept of the soul, passing through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. The simple markings on the boards change into different stages of an individual's life, or the trials their Ba may encounter on their way to the afterlife. Tomb paintings depict loved ones playing Senet with the deceased, or the deceased playing against an unseen spirit or perhaps their own soul, as seen in the tomb of Nefertari. Some Senet boards of this period contain inscriptions on every space, not just the final 5, as was typical. Some evoke specific Egyptian gods, like square number 1, the house of Thoth, or square number 10, the house of Wajet. Others offer aid to the Ba as it passes through the Duat, like square number 20, the house of bread, that provides sustenance, or square number 19, the house of the steering oar, that provides the soul with the opportunity to join the crew of the sun god's solar ship. Others are still a mystery, like space number 6, the house of Tenet, which may be a reference to a festival, or space number 22, the house of spitting. Senet exists in ancient Egypt for 3,000 years with very little variation in terms of the core game, even after it begins to hold this deep religious significance. One possible reason for this is that it really wasn't played outside of Egypt. The one thing that we know for certain about ancient games is that if they were enjoyable to play, they quickly spread around the region and the world, adapting and adjusting to local cultures and beliefs. Renowned historian Irving Finkel also finds this curious. He says, "The interesting thing about Senet is that it's unlike all the other games of the Middle East because it's very well represented in Egypt, but it's not played outside in the rest of the Middle East, as far as we know." So why is that? Having played Senet, I'd say it's not a great game. I mean, it's not a bad game, but it's also not the first game you'd pull off the shelf to play with friends, so you can't pin its longevity on gameplay. I think it's clear that it has everything to do with the cultural significance. This was a civilization that had deep and meaningful rituals around death and the afterlife, and to the ancient Egyptians, Senet literally helped you prepare for your journey through the underworld. Senet connected with Egyptian players in a way that just didn't translate to other cultures. As an aside, two names kept popping up when I researched the rules of Senet: R.C. Bell and Timothy Kendall. These two men independently developed rule sets for the game. Bell is a well-known and well-respected game historian. I've seen his name referenced in many historical gaming works. I wasn't familiar with Kendall, but come to find out he's a working archaeologist who has spent much of his adult life in digs in Egypt, still does today. I was curious to see how their rules might differ, so I was delighted when I found a website that outlined the two rule sets side by side. Now, admittedly, the site I found was a little sketchy. It claimed to be a monthly games magazine published on the internet, but it hadn't been updated since the year 2000. The rules of Kendall's version were essentially as described in the beginning of this video. Both players start with their pieces alternating in the first row, then take turns moving them from the upper left of the board to the lower right to bar off. But the rules for Bell's version were significantly different. Same board, same pieces, but in the description, players started with all their pieces off the board, entered at the lower right, and made their way to the upper left, the goal being to be the first to position their pieces in alternating spaces. In other words, Bell's victory condition was Kendall's starting position. So I was perplexed at how two scholars could look at the same evidence and come up with such different conclusions. After all, there's a finite number of tomb paintings, carvings, and fragments of text to go on. I found that Bell had written a book on games called Board and Table Games from Many Civilizations. I ordered it immediately. I was hoping that it would contain not only a description of the rules of Senet, but some insight into how he came to his conclusions. When it arrived, I was disappointed to see that it was only a description of the rules, but I was surprised to see that his rules were nearly identical to Kendall's version. Some of Bell's rules on entering the board and movement are a little fiddly, but it's still recognizably the same game. I went back to the sketchy website, which, fortunately, had a list of references. It referenced the board game book, written by Bell and published the same year as Board and Table Games from Many Civilizations, 1979. So was this the same book? I found a copy on eBay and bought it. While I was waiting for it to arrive, I explored Kendall's work. I had read that Kendall had also published a book on Senet. Well, it was described as a pamphlet, not a book. I did some searching and was amazed to find that Kendall hadn't just published his research, he partnered with a game company and released an entire playable Senet set. I found one in great condition on eBay for $18. It is a remarkable set. It comes with a Senet board, casting sticks, and wooden playing pieces. Best of all, the quote-unquote pamphlet is a 67-page booklet that takes a deep dive into his research. It is full of information that I hadn't seen anywhere else, like these photos of all 4 Senet sets from King Tut's tomb. This ornate version is always referenced, but I'd never seen the other 3. This is another highly decorated set, but these 2 are small travel-size sets. It even contains 7 pages of additional notes and comments that Kendall must have thought of after the booklet was printed. I have to laugh at the idea of someone in 1979 seeing this game on the shelf and saying, "Oh, this looks like fun," then opening it up to find not a rule book, but 61 pages of dense, highly annotated, scholarly work on Egyptian funeral rituals and how they influence the board game. Then there's 6 pages of how to play at the very end. Hilarious. About a week later, Bell's book arrived. And when it did, man, it is a giant coffee table book, and it's just gorgeous. It's full of beautiful color illustrations, as well as several prints of historical games and original art. Naturally, I first turned to the rules for Senet. The rules in this book are different from both Kendall's rules and what was published on that website. In this version, pieces start off the board and move from the upper left to the lower right, but then end in the every other space configuration. This is essentially what was outlined on the sketchy website, other than starting from the lower right, which I can forgive since the board illustrated in this book shows a version of the board from the Middle Kingdom period, when the final 5 squares were shifted to the upper left. So where's that leave us? My gut is to believe the rules Bell outlined in Board and Table Games from Many Civilizations. His work was originally published in 2 volumes, the first appearing in 1960, nearly 20 years before the coffee table book was published. The combined version of his work was republished in 1979, the same year as the coffee table book. I'm unclear on how much input Bell had in the coffee table book, as the intro mentions that, quote, "many of the games reproduced in the board game book are from an especially fine collection built up by R.C. Bell over many years," end quote. This makes it sound like it's not coming from Bell directly, but the editors. My belief is that this beautiful book was published at the same time as the reissue of his earlier works in order to maximize profit. But that is a guess. So, which rules are the most accurate? We can't know. Realistically, neither is really right. I could keep researching, but sometimes when you fall down a rabbit hole like this, you just have to let it go. Not surprisingly, Senet falls out of use following the Roman period, starting around 30 BCE. Part of this was the increasing influence of Christianity in the region, which worked to drive out pagan elements from the culture. Strangely enough, this helped Senet return to where it began, a secular game played just for fun. There are theories that Senet transformed, or at least strongly influenced, other games, such as Tab, a game still popular in Egypt and Sudan today. The last datable depiction of Senet we know of is painted on the ceiling of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, dated around 100 CE. One final thought on Senet. We're probably pronouncing the name wrong. In Kendall's work, he reminds us that the ancient Egyptian writing system has no express vowels.
But once you know the vowels...
In ancient Egyptian, the word is written only with consonants, like this. I won't go into the minutiae of how the sound of the word is reconstructed, which even Kendall admits is mostly guesswork, but in the time of Tutankhamun, it could have been pronounced Sina, and 1,000 years earlier, at the time of the pyramid builders, it may have been pronounced Zinet. So, now that you know the rules and history of Senet, however it's pronounced, how do you win? As far as strategy goes, I'm only addressing the modernly accepted version of the rules. When planning your moves, keep in mind with the casting sticks, statistically the number 2 comes up more than any other number. So, plan ahead in moves of 2. Try to advance your pieces around the board in pairs to avoid being swapped with your opponent's piece. Often you can advance a pair, then add to it to create a blockade, which, remember, not only protects your pieces, but also makes it impossible for your opponent to pass by. Now, this sounds dumb, but with so many opportunities to get extra turns, it can be easy to lose track of where you are. I literally count on my fingers to make sure I don't screw myself out of a turn. The special squares are powerful, especially number 15, the House of Rejuvenation. It's an extra turn, but it's also a strong midway spot to set up a blockade and stymie your opponent's movement. Since you can't be landed on while you're there, you can block your opponent's movement with a single piece instead of 2 or 3. Remember, it can be jumped over. Finally, you have to stop on the House of Joy, regardless of your toss. Don't waste larger moves when you're this close to the square. And that's Senet. Thank you for watching, As a reminder, there's links in the description to a video that shows you how you can make your own board and a printable PDF of the game. If this is the kind of content you enjoy, I put out 2 new videos the 2nd and 4th Thursdays of every month. One on rules, history, and strategy of an ancient game, and a second one showing how to build your own version. Click the subscribe button so you don't miss anything new. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on The Gaming Bench.